To survive the pair of FW-190s that bounced him in January 1944, it will take all the guts and flying skill Don Gentili can rally. That, plus a ton of perseverance. Fortunately, he displays plenty of the latter, even as a kid.
Well, Don Gentili was born in Piqua, Ohio, to Italian immigrant parents, and at a very early age, he decided he wanted to learn how to fly. He was 6 years old when he spread his arms out and jumped off the family stairwell and promptly broke his elbow. So that was his first attempt.
Throughout his combat career, Don Gentili continues to exhibit this same quality of never giving up. But that's not the only thing he's got going for him.
Gentili's strengths as a combat pilot were actually an array of skills. He was a very, very talented pilot. He also had great eyesight. In fact, he would spot the enemy oftentimes long before anyone else in his flight would. The other thing he had was quick reflexes. He could assess a situation very quickly, and before anyone else was done counting the aircraft they had just spotted, he would already be pressing the attack.
These are some of the classic attributes possessed by many of the great aces throughout history. However, the same aggressiveness that drives Gentili to fearlessly charge into an attack also has a downside.
And in fact, early in his fighting career, he was seen as kind of a one-man show, and it wasn't really until later that he realized the value of teamwork. Fortunately, because he was such a skilled pilot, the situations he'd get himself into with his aggressiveness were overcome quickly by his ability to shoot the enemy down. So it might have been a combination of luck and a combination of skill that overcame the weakness, and that main weakness probably would be that he just couldn't hold himself back.
Yet even though Gentili can sometimes act like a wild man in the cockpit, he rarely continues that behavior on the ground.
He wasn't one to carouse. He wasn't prone to partying. Although he had an occasional drink and an occasional cigar, he pretty much concentrated on his job and flying and the business of aerial combat.
To Don Gentili, a big part of the business of aerial combat is tactics. And while he's not a big fan of his P-47 when he first gets it in late 1942, he spends a lot of time getting to know its flying qualities. That's because he knows the technical aspects of a fighter are closely linked to the tactics its driver can and can't use in combat. For all Thunderbolt pilots, an important feature is their plane's excellent high-altitude performance. This is reflected in the tactics the Jugs use during bomber escort missions.
The bombers were normally flying in altitude range of 20 to 25,000 feet, and the escort fighters would be stacked above those bombers 25 to 35,000 feet. Quite often they would do this in 3 squadron groups, with one squadron being high on the sun side, the leading squadron a little bit lower, roughly over the center of the bomber formation, and the third squadron to the other side of the bombers and at an intermediate altitude. Later on in the war, they would fly several miles out in front of the bomber formation and fan out to find the enemy fighters before they could get to the bombers.
When they do find enemy fighters, the Jugs like to keep a numerical advantage.
P-47 doctrine was to outnumber the enemy by 2 to 1. So if the enemy was a 2-ship element, the P-47s would normally send down a 4-ship section to engage that element and leave the rest high for cover. If the enemy was a 4-ship section, they would probably send an 8-ship flight to engage the element. German fighters could outclimb and outturn the P-47 below about 20,000 feet, while the P-47 could outdive and outroll the German fighters. So the P-47s would normally try to fight above 20,000 feet.
But sometimes the P-47s are the ones getting attacked. Fortunately, if they're up high enough, the Jug drivers have an almost fail-safe way to escape from German fighters.
If attacked from the rear, the standard P-47 defensive tactic was to roll over upside down and pull into a vertical dive in a maneuver called a split S. The P-47 could outroll the enemy fighters, so they could make this roll and pull faster than the enemy could roll and follow them. Once they got that nose pointed down, It was a real freight train, and they could outdive anything in the theater.
Jug drivers also like to use their fighters' amazing downhill speed on offense.
The P-47s like to dive on the enemy from an altitude advantage and would only turn with them as long as they could keep the enemy in their gun sights. At that point, they would come off, climb back up high, zoom up, and possibly come back for another attack.
Normally, the Jugs fight in pairs made up of a leader and a wingman, just like all other U.S. fighters. But Don Gentili sometimes bends the rules with his wingman.
When Gentili had an experienced wingman, he'd often let that wingman attack one enemy fighter while Gentili attacked the other. This was unusual because normal American Air Force doctrine at the time was the shooter cover, where the leader did all the shooting and the wingman was only defensive.
The tactics used by the Butcher Bird are very similar to those employed by all U.S. fighters, including the Jug.
The Focke Wulf 190 normally flew in a two-ship element called a rota, with a lead and a wing fighter. The lead fighter, just as in the American doctrine, was the primary shooter, and the wingman was the primary defense. They would combine two of these elements into a flight of four using finger four formations that they called a swarm, very much like the Americans.
This similarity in tactics is not because the Germans copy us, it's actually the other way around. In fact, German ace Werner Mulders is a key figure among a small group of pilots who develop both the leader and wingman tactic and the finger four. They do so while fighting in the German expeditionary force, called the Condor Legion, during the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. These tactics are so successful that they're quickly adopted by the entire Luftwaffe, and soon after that, by most other air forces around the world. But by early 1944, the German fighters need new tactics to effectively deal with the hordes of U.S. heavy bombers that are pulverizing their country. Luftwaffe commanders quickly realized that the first requirement is to have as many fighters as possible to make the attack.
January 14th, 1944. Don Gentili is flying his P-47 Thunderbolt on a freelance mission over France. That's a fighter sweep, with part of his squadron flying low to strafe enemy airfields and the rest flying high for top cover. Gentili was part of the high element, and just minutes ago scored his 5th and 6th kills, both over Focke Wulf Fw 190s. That makes him a brand new ace. But during those dogfights, Gentili got pulled down to low altitude and was separated from his wingman, so now he's a singleton. As Gentili starts to climb back up to rejoin his squadron, his low P-47 is spotted by a pair of Fw-190s. They immediately roll into engage. Gentili sees the 190s before they're within firing range. He begins a sharp left-hand defensive break turn towards his attackers. He's trying to create the highest degree of angle off his tail to make for a very high and hence very difficult deflection shot for the enemy pilots. Gentili does so and forces an overshoot by the 190s. Gentili now reverses his turn back to the right, trying to go offensive. And he gets a momentary high deflection snapshot off of the trailing 190. But the shot misses because the 190s have also started a hard right-hand turn. Gentili tries to wrestle his big T-bolt nose around further to the right to get a better firing solution. Yet with the 190's superior turn rate, he can't get his nose out and lead to track him. Gentili has no choice now but to hang back and lag and follow the 190's around in a daisy chain. That's because with the 190's better rate of climb, he knows he can't climb out of the fight. And he's too low to take advantage of the T-bolt's outstanding ability to dive. With the 190's better turning ability, they're slowly gaining on him. Gentili has one advantage. His P-47 has a slightly better roll rate than the 190. Just before the FWs get close enough for a gun solution, Gentili snaps into a hard left-hand turn. The 190's flash find another overshoot. And Gentili reverses back to the right, trying again to gain the offensive. He gets another very high angle gun whiz on the lead 190 and pulls the trigger. But nothing happens. He's out of ammo. must have used it all up in making his other 2 kills. And even worse, the lead 190 pilot sees that he's out. The 190s get back on Gentili's tail, and the train starts all over again. I gotta say, this lead 190 driver is good. Previously, he had not been maneuvering his fighter to its maximum capabilities. Probably because he knew his far less experienced wingman couldn't keep up. Or because he expected Gentili in his T-47 to be easy pickings. But now that he knows Gentili's out of ammo, it's a whole different ballgame. The lead 190 pilot turns his plane as hard as he can. His wingman cannot match the turn and slides out of the chain. Without his experienced leader, this 190 driver knows that there's nothing left to do but haul ass out of the combat zone. And now it's one-on-one, with the experienced 190 pilot continuing his turning duel with Gentili's T-47. But look at this. Instead of increasing his speed to close the range further, the German pilots actually ease it back on the throttle to match Gentili's speed. It's a very smart move by the 190 driver. With his 190's better rate of turn, all the German pilot has to do now is hold the same speed as the T-47 and let the angles reduce the range until he gets close enough to smoke Gentili. But Gentili still has a few tricks up his sleeve. He keeps turning horizontally until the 190 is almost in a firing solution. Then he suddenly rolls wings level and jerks the nose of his T-bolt up, climbing out of the 190's plane of motion. This is known as a vertical jig, and it's a great move by Gentili. He totally spoiled the 190's firing angle. Gentili's now using his T-bolt's superior roll rate to try and keep the 190 out of sync. This will prevent the 190 from stabilizing long enough to get a good shot, something us fighter pilots call jigging, to keep that enemy aircraft out of sync, or out of phase. The German pilot tries to pull his 190 in for another shot at Gentili. But Gentili once again quickly rolls his wings, almost inverted, pulls hard into a descending turn. So the Germans still can't get a good firing solution. However, the 190 driver reacts fast and follows Gentili. Gentili now tries another quick roll into a climb. But the 190 driver anticipates the move and gets off a good shot. Scoring cannon and machine gun hits all over Gentili's plane. My God, another fighter would be going down in flames after hits like that. Yet the big, rugged T-bolt still keeps on flying. Gentili snaps into another turn, messing up the 190's firing angle again. But the 190 turns with him. Gentili now realizes that no matter what he tries, he's not going to shake this German pilot off his 6 o'clock. His only chance is to try and survive long enough for the 190 to run out of ammo or gas. But can he make it that far? Gentili's hands are starting to sweat as the 190 keeps turning right along with his T-bolt, inching closer and closer to another good firing angle. Finally, in a near panic, Gentili flips on his radio.
Horseback! Horseback! Help! Help! I'm being collared!
Horseback is Gentili's squadron call sign. He's hoping one of his buddies at a higher altitude can roll in and clean the 190 off his 6.
Now, if you will tell me your call sign and approximate position, we'll send help. I'm down here by a railroad track with a 190! God damn it!
Gentili's so stressed he can't even remember his call sign, let alone the specific location. And with the 190 getting closer and closer to a firing solution by the second, he doesn't have time to think about it. And you know what? I can tell you that's all too common in the heat of battle. Radio discipline is usually one of the first things to go. Wow, what a situation. Don Gentili's on the verge of getting smoked by an FW-190, and the rest of his squadron can't find him to help out. This could be the end of the road for this new ace.